Speaking of speakers, our first speaker is the wonderful Dr. Diana Pavlac Glyer, professor of English in the Honors College at Azusa Pacific University. She has published extensively on Lewis, Tolkien, and the Inklings, and her seminal work, The Company They Keep, and the popular version, which is the one I read, Bandersnatch, Lewis, Tolkien, and the Creative Collaboration of the Inklings. In these books, Dr. Glyer demonstrates the influence each of the Inklings had on each other's work and the implications of those things. This scholarship changed the way that we understand who the Inklings were as a community. Diana is a passionate professor whose students love her. And if you get a moment, you might want to ask her about her lecture on Dante's Purgatorio, where she uses picnic equipment as metaphors for the soul. That might be fun. You may know Diana as a scholar and lecturer, but I also want you to know about her artistry. She is a potter who has spent many an hour at the wheel practicing her artistry and contemplating God as the potter and we as the clay. Her writing, her teaching, and her work as an artist all circle back to one common theme: creativity thrives in community. Diana's work was the whole inspiration for our theme this year, Surprised by Love, intellectual hospitality in an age of uncertainty. And as we embark on the plenary portion of our week together, we turn to the scholar whose own tenacity and curiosity led to a whole new world of understanding of intellectual hospitality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Diana Pavlac Glyer.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that generous introduction. Thank you for all of the sacrifices and commitments that you made to be here present in person in this place. And I'd like to extend a welcome to those who are live streaming with us. Isn't it wonderful to think about the ways in which our gathering here is extended across the globe through the magic of technology? So a few months ago, I got into an argument with a really good friend. Like most arguments, this one involved a whole lot of tears and a whole lot of screaming. And after about an hour and a half of this, as things started to wind down, she looked at me with wonder and she said, "I completely and utterly disagree with you, but I love the reasons why you believe what you do." I want you to remember that sentence as we go through this week together, as you head home at the end of this conference, as you negotiate the hard conversations that are ahead of you. I want you to remember that sentence. I completely and utterly disagree with you, but I love the reasons why you believe what you do. Because that, in a nutshell, is the heart of intellectual hospitality. Well, maybe not the screaming and crying part. But the raw honesty, deep conviction, risky engagement, and mutual love. Let me say those four things again. Raw honesty, deep conviction, risky engagement, and mutual love. Let me set the stage for the remarks I want to make this morning. In 2014, I spoke about intellectual hospitality at an event here in Oxford. And I tried in that talk to present an apologetic, the reasons why I think that intellectual hospitality is an effective guide, possibly even to bridging the gaps that divide us. In that lecture, I talked about my experience with a very unusual class. It was a semester-long course on C.S. Lewis, and what made the class so challenging is that I had never encountered a group of students so diverse in their convictions. How do you talk about difficult topics when you are in the midst of a group that is deeply divided? That's the challenge, and as their teacher, I needed to learn new ways to negotiate it, and the practice of intellectual hospitality is what made all the difference for me. Today in this talk, I want to get a little more specific and maybe just even a little bit more practical than I did in that previous talk. As we start the conference, I want to take some time to examine some key terms, to offer some clear definitions, and I hope give you some very, very practical help. And I hope these comments will serve to sort of orient all of us as we begin our conversation this week. Think of this talk as an introduction to ideas that we will unpack over the next few days. Informal presentations, yes, but also in our informal times over coffee or a pint. So how bad is it, our contentious age? 8 years ago, when I first started talking about intellectual hospitality, I think we all recognized a growing sense of uneasiness. It was getting harder and harder to talk about controversial topics. And it seems to me, and I think to others, that these days it seems to be an all-out daily contest of clashing ideas. It's gotten painful, hasn't it? The hostility and the stress. And it's not that we haven't always held different points of view. It's just that in the current climate, disagreement seems to be characterized by a spirit of hostility and contempt at a level I haven't seen in my lifetime. Statistics abound, but here are a few indicators. Pew Research finds that on average, Democrats and Republicans are further apart today than at any point in the past 50 years. And the polarization is accelerating. In 1994, 17% of Republicans had a very unfavorable impression of Democrats, and 16% of Democrats held a very unfavorable view of the GOP. Those percentages are 17% and 16%, but recently, highly negative views have more than doubled. And now more than a third of Republicans and Democrats view members of the opposite party in strongly negative or even hostile terms. Those are the national trends, but the implications of that are very personal, aren't they? And research finds that 1 in 6 of us has stopped talking to a close friend or family member because we cannot negotiate these differences. You know, I wonder, though, if we really need any of these statistics. You've had hard conversations lately. You've seen violent disagreement and bitter insults on your social media feeds. You've felt that awkward pause in a conversation with a friend where all of a sudden you wonder to yourself, do I say something? Or is it safer just to back off? And you've had those moments where you pressed in, maybe even screamed and cried a little. Maybe it didn't go so well. Can we agree to disagree? Can we vote differently and still get along? Can we hold diametrically opposed views on life's most essential questions and still honor one another? Can we really learn to say, I completely and utterly disagree with you, but I love you and the reasons why you believe what you do? These are some of the questions we gather to wrestle with this week. Now, I'm going to be as clear and direct as I know how. Conflicts arise because we hold deep convictions about really important issues, essential issues like abortion, marriage equality, gun control, immigration policies, racial strife, climate change, and even whether or not we should be wearing masks right now. You know, it's crazy. We even disagree about what of these things is most urgent. The top issue for Trump supporters, as it turns out, is the economy and crime, and Biden supporters prioritize health care. And forgive me. I mentioned those topics and I named those names and I chose the vocabulary I did because I know that just hearing me say that stuff out loud and using the words that I chose makes some of us want to jump in and correct even the vocabulary that we use to describe these issues. A list like that shakes us up a little, doesn't it? And right off the bat, we feel the urge to jump in and explain, or maybe even just defend ourselves. Seriously. As you think about this past year, is there anyone in this room who hasn't faced an awkward or infuriating conversation with someone with whom you disagree? As we gather this week, we've chosen to address this pervasive tension by exploring the term intellectual hospitality. I want to offer a definition of that. Think about some of the alternate phrases we could be using. We could be gathered to talk simply about civility or tolerance, maybe kindness, or how about grace? Let's take a few minutes and look at the vocabulary of conflict. Our conference theme is Surprised by Love, cultivating intellectual hospitality in an age of uncertainty. Now, the phrase intellectual hospitality has been around for quite some time. C.S. Lewis uses the phrase intellectual hospitality in a letter written to his colleague Eugene Vinaver in May of 1959. Now, Vinaver was a university professor whose expertise was in the King Arthur legends, a topic near and dear to Lewis's heart. These two scholars became close friends, and through the years, Lewis and Vinaver exchanged scholarly manuscripts and wrote extensive critiques of each other's work. Lewis's letters to Vinaver are an enthusiastic mixture of appreciation, instruction, correction, and almost violent disagreement. Iron sharpened iron, as these two scholars argued over dozens of technical details from the stories of King Arthur, and both men were grateful for the experience. Lewis writes to Vinaver with warmth and enthusiasm, saying 1,000 thanks for both corporeal and intellectual hospitality. 1,000 thanks. Gratitude. Now, I've tried to trace the origins of the phrase intellectual hospitality going back as far as I can, and I found use of it dating from the late 1800s. But as Andrew mentioned this morning and began to unpack for us, the fundamental concept behind intellectual hospitality is rooted in the sense of what is hospitality. What does that word mean? We may think of it in terms of inviting our friends to come over to house, but the core concept of this kind of hospitality is rooted in the ancient world in an age without hotels, without Airbnbs, without dorm rooms. In the ancient world, people who traveled over long distances needed an opportunity to rest and a chance to replenish their supplies for the next stage of their journey. There were no hotels. So a system of guidelines was established, listen, that allowed travelers to stay at the home of a stranger. Some of you may remember reading about these guidelines if you've read the Iliad or especially the Odyssey. These guidelines allowed those who were traveling in an unfamiliar town to knock on a stranger's door and request a meal or a place to stay for the night. And we see reference to this kind of hospitality in Hebrews 13. These guidelines protected the stranger, and they also, this is important, they also constrained the expectations that were put on the host. Maybe one of the most important things to keep in mind as we explore the idea of intellectual hospitality is that its roots go into a system that establishes good boundaries that are mutual, with expectations on both parties. Michelle Hirschberger writes, in the hospitality encounter, both host and guest are blessed, and both act as givers as well as receivers. She explains, hospitality is understood by the original audience of the Bible and for ancients in general had nothing to do with being nice. It simply meant love for the stranger And while ancient hospitality usually involved food and lodging, it also implied a relationship of mutual respect, honor, a willingness to be open to the other. So in brief, intellectual hospitality is vigorous, it is robust, and it is tough-minded. And because of that, it is not easy. It requires being vulnerable, lowering our defenses, suspending our initial resistance, and at the same time, being willing to be direct and honest about where we stand. Now, negotiating this tension, an illustration may be helpful. I think that some of the best writing on radical hospitality comes from the Benedictine tradition. Starting back in the 6th century, guests at Benedictine monasteries were automatically offered food and lodging for as long as they wanted. The monks were open-hearted. But as Saint Benedict himself writes, quote, "If in that period the guest should be found troublesome or vicious, not only should he not be incorporated within the community, he should be told frankly to leave." Open-hearted, yes, but also tough-minded, built on a base of deep honor for one another, an honor that is mutual. In the Benedictine tradition, as in the biblical model, and as in the ancient world of Greece and Rome, hospitality assumes a balance of receptivity and confrontation. Or perhaps the best shorthand for it is this: intellectual hospitality requires that perfect balance of truth and love. With that background in mind, I'd like to offer a working definition. Here we go. Intellectual hospitality occurs when persons of good will seek to engage with one another with the goal of greater understanding. It is modeled on the ancient practice of offering sanctuary to the stranger, while at the same time honoring specific guidelines that constrain both host and guest. It is built on mutual respect, and it serves as a practical expression of humility, patience, and curiosity. Let me take a few minutes to unpack that. Intellectual hospitality assumes persons of good will. There's a foundational agreement by both parties to abide by guidelines and boundaries. In short, to follow the rules. Intellectual hospitality is, in its essence, mutual. And its goal is not to prove my case or change the other person. Now, there's a time for that. There's a time when we argue together to try to change or rehabilitate someone else's understanding. But in intellectual hospitality, the goal is a change in me. I engage in the hopes that I will grow in understanding, not in order to reach consensus either. Because when done well, we often find our differences are even more fundamental and profound than we anticipated. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. In order to engage, to enrich our understanding of each other, and our understanding of the topic at hand, humility is the fundamental requirement. I really love what John Bennett says about encountering people that we disagree with. He says the receiving is marked by awareness that however initially strange, the perspective of the other could easily supplement and perhaps correct one's own work, or even transform one's self-understanding. In other words, I begin with humility, assuming there are things I need to learn. I proceed with curiosity, eager to gain new information, and I exercise patience with myself and others. I think it's pretty easy to understand how hospitality works then in this physical sense. But exactly how do we translate these principles into the world of ideas? How do I behave as a good host or a good guest when I am confronted with an opinion that I do not like? Rather than reacting with defensiveness or contradiction, we choose hospitality. We pause and we stay open to the possibility of learning something new. And I believe we learn to do that by learning to ask better questions. And here are some of the questions that I personally have found enormously helpful. First question: what do you believe? Help me understand that better. Have you discovered this? That many times when we debate one another, we're actually not arguing with what the other person believes. We're arguing with what we assume the other person believes. So our first move is to make sure that we're clear. What do they believe? Where do they stand? What is the extent of it? Next question. What information is that based on? Oh, these days this question is so important because we see different news. We read different sources of information. We have access to different kinds of approaches. I love what my friend Jerry Root says. He says, the person you disagree with knows something that you do not. Find out what that is. Here's a third question, I think a very powerful question. What moral priorities is your belief built upon? In other words, help me understand what is at stake from your point of view. You see, there's a tendency for all of us to see our views as fundamentally good and to see opposing views as fundamentally evil. And there are situations where that is clearly the case. However, in many situations, the debate is actually not good versus evil, but two competing virtues, two good things that have come into conflict with one another that we don't know how to reconcile. As Arthur Brooks points out, people who disagree with us are not necessarily immoral in most cases. They simply have different moral foundations. They prioritize a different level of moral priorities in terms of what's at stake with a particular perspective. Do you remember maybe back in high school when you were introduced to the idea of a moral dilemma? Right? This is often posed back in high school as the sort of Nazi at the door scenario. Have some of you heard of that? A Nazi knocks on your door and asks politely whether or not you're hiding Jews in your house. And you face a moral dilemma. Do I uphold the priority of truth and say, no, of course not, right? Or do I prioritize the saving of life and lie? What's at conflict there are two moral priorities. We are on the horns of a dilemma. The more that we seek to learn about the moral principles that are underneath our convictions, the quicker we can get to the point where we can disagree about conclusions but still affirm one another's fundamental values. It helps us realize that we can completely and utterly disagree, but we can also love them and love the reasons why they believe what they do. I hope that brings some clarity to this important topic, the theme of our conference. I want to take this one step further by showing what intellectual hospitality looks like in action. So let's go a little bit beyond concept and definition, and let me make this practical. Let me show you how these ideas might play out when faced with conflict. I want to borrow an illustration from Arthur Brooks. Here is the scenario that he faced. Right after Brooks published his first book, he received a hostile email, more than 5,000 words long. In it, the sender not only criticized every single chapter of the book in vitriolic detail, he also attacked Brooks personally informing him of his, quote, numerous inadequacies as a researcher and as a person. What would you do if you had received such an email? What do you do when you are sitting at the Thanksgiving table and someone leans in and attacks something you hold dear? What are your options in a situation like that? As Brooks sat and read and reread the insulting email, 3 possible responses came to his mind. Option number 1, ignore him. Option number 2, insult him. Option number 3, destroy him. What did he do? Brooks says, quote, I accidentally picked a 4th option, and it created a huge epiphany for me. As I read his email, I was insulted, and I felt attacked. But I also kept thinking, good golly, he read my book. I was filled with gratitude. I had put my whole heart into that project, and this guy had taken the time and read every chapter. Brooks continues. So I wrote back and I said, I realized he really hated my book, but that it had taken me a lot of work to write, and I deeply appreciated his time and attention to every detail. So what do you suppose happens next? Brooks writes, 15 minutes later, a second message from the guy pops up in my inbox. I opened the email and I braced myself. But instead of another attack, he said he was shocked that I'd read his note. And the next time I was in Dallas, we should grab some dinner. From enemy to friend in a matter of minutes, end quote. Here is Brooks' conclusion. Did he suddenly like my book? Of course not. He simply learned that he liked me because I had taken the time to read his email and I was nice in the way I responded. Ignore him, insult him, destroy him. Brooks discovered a 4th option. Express gratitude. Look for something good, or to paraphrase the Apostle Paul, find something that is true, noble, and just. Something that is right, honest, pure, lovely, and admirable, excellent or praiseworthy, and make a decision to focus on such things. Philippians 4:8. I want to suggest that when we are faced with conflict, there are, in fact, many different options, not just 3, not just 4, but many more options than we might suppose. Imagine the scenario. You're having coffee with a good friend, and the conversation suddenly becomes very tense as you realize, to your dismay, that you have very different views on a critical topic. At that moment, you are at a crossroads. You have a decision to make. How do you respond? Brooks begins with 3 options. He concludes that there are 4. I want to suggest that there are dozens of options in such a situation. I think we need to think bigger. I think it is helpful to consider the widest possible range. Indifference, detachment, hatred, hostility, contempt, conviction, tolerance, civility, correction. It's one of my favorites. Let me just explain this to you for a while, right? Politeness, capitulation. Here's the bottom line. When we face conflicts, There are lots of options. More than I've listed here, more than we might guess, and I think that wisdom means understanding that different responses are appropriate in different situations. Not only do we need to be adaptable, I also think it's important to consider our motives as well as our behavior. For example, there are times when I may need to detach because I feel contempt, anger, or impatience. I may be feeling disrespect, arrogance, or disgust. And those are problematic. Not because there's a problem with the action, but there's a problem with my heart. On the other hand, there may be times when I need to disengage or detach simply because this issue isn't a priority for me right now, or I simply do not have the bandwidth to address it today. Or perhaps I've not been successful in the past when I've addressed this issue with this person, and for my own well-being, I just need to move on. Or maybe this is not a safe person and I need to establish a boundary. Detaching can be a profound expression of love and self-care. In a similar way, there may be times when civility and kindness are called for. When you're dealing with a coworker, a family member, sometimes you can't disengage. Sometimes you just can't, but you also can't keep on fighting the same fight, having the same conversation. So we exercise good manners, we are civil, we protect our hearts, and we get on with our day. Of all the options on that list, I think that contempt is particularly bad. We tend to acknowledge that hatred and hostility are bad, and as Christians we agree that hostility does not fulfill the law of Christ, but we can fool ourselves into thinking that it's okay to nurture a hot and quiet contempt. But the cost is enormous. Frankly, there are few things as bad for our mental, moral, and physical health as contempt. As the saying goes, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. What about hostility or hatred? I would argue that there are ideas that I hate. There are attitudes that disgust me. There are behaviors that break my heart because to my mind they violate everything that is holy. But I do not believe that we should harbor contempt, hostility, or hatred toward people. Ideas may be contemptible, but not people. I firmly believe that our faith does not give us that option. Why? Because we're called to love. The greatest command is love. God is love. And as we grow in faith, we must grow in love. But here, more than with any other term or any other guideline, we have a definition problem. C.S. Lewis is absolutely right when he says, love is something more stern and splendid than mere kindness. Stern, splendid, full of glory. Love is not a warm bath of good feelings that paints over evil and calls it good. In his writing on love, Lewis invokes Thomas Aquinas, who describes love as the choice to will the good of the other. In that context, in this context, in the context of our week together, I suggest we look at love this way. Love is a disciplined orientation toward a person that goes deeper than mere kindness, that extends beyond mere tolerance, and chooses to cultivate a sincere commitment to seek that person's highest good. This is how Lewis elaborates that concept. Lewis says that though God has often rebuked us, he has never regarded us with contempt. He has paid us the intolerable compliment of loving us in the deepest, most tragic, and most inexorable sense. That word, inexorable. Inexorable. It means that God's love is relentless, unstoppable, inescapable, unswerving. Can we learn to practice love in its deepest, most tragic, most inexorable sense? Can we learn to speak truth without compromise, but also without pride, without contempt, and without hostility? Can we be Christians who are known by love? I can't stop thinking about that. In all my research and all of my preparation, I kept circling back again and again to that question. Can we learn to love like that? I can't get that question off of my mind. So I want to end with a story. A story that helps me understand why this issue is so important, why it is so important that you are here today. To share with you what I think is at stake as we try to hold fast to both truth and love in an angry and contentious culture as we commit ourselves to getting better and better at cultivating intellectual hospitality in an age of uncertainty. So here we go. So years ago, I lived in a large apartment complex in the suburbs of Chicago. One of those big, sprawling apartment complexes that's arranged a little bit like a hotel, where everyone has to enter through a central kind of receiving area, and then they go down through the corridors to the various floors where the individual apartments are. And since the front door was locked and there was a sort of lobby situation, my roommate and I rarely locked the door to our apartment. So one evening, Joy and I were sitting in the living room. We were watching television, and all of a sudden the door flew open, suddenly flew open, and a woman came in and slammed the door behind her. She was shaking, and she had been crying. We had never seen her before. We didn't have any idea who she was. So we brought her in. She sat down, and this is what she said. My boyfriend is after me. This is the fourth time he is after me, and I think this time he is going to kill me. I live up on the third floor. I got away, and I ran like hell, but when I came down your hallway, I saw the cross on your door. I saw the cross on your door. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go, but I saw the cross. I saw the cross on your door, and I knew if I can just get inside that door, I will be safe. We helped her, over the next few days. We helped her to get out of her situation and to find the support that she needed. I will never forget that night. In light of our conference theme, I just keep wondering. When people see the cross on our churches, when people see the cross on the jewelry that we wear, on the way we decorate our homes, when people see reference to Christ in our publications and our conference brochures, when people find out we are Christians, is their first thought, I know what that cross means. It means safety. It means provision. It means life. It means help when I am hurting, real concern for my well-being. It means kindness, goodness, and faithfulness. In a culture of contempt and uncertainty, at a time when people are so tired and afraid and confused, sick of all fighting? Will they run to us for refuge? Will they know we are Christians by our love? Thank you.
Let's take a minute to breathe. Diana, I know we're supposed to have Q&A time, but I hardly know what to say. And I thank you, Diana, that your scholarship, your intellectual capacity does not stop in your head. You've modeled for us a whole new kind of intellectual living. Friends, I don't want to miss this opportunity. We have 10 minutes to ask Diana a question. So are you okay to do that, Diana?
Yes.
As you're writing out your questions and coming to the microphone, let me remind you that your questions should be succinct, civil, in the form of a question, and useful for the community as a whole. Please state your name when you introduce yourself so Diana can greet you by name. I'm going to start us off. I'm Amber Saladin.
Hi, Amber.
Diana, can you, given your love of the Inklings and our love of the Inklings, and our place in the world at this moment, can you give us some examples of how the Inklings showed this kind of intellectual hospitality to each other?
Just want to say thank you for that response. It means a lot to me, so thank you. If you think about the Inklings, there are lots of examples that we could list. See Andrew Lazo after this session for 14 examples of specific instances with chapter and verse explaining this dynamic interaction. I just want to say this. The thing that thrills me as I've studied the work of the Inklings and looked at their interaction and their meetings together is how much joy they took in being corrected. And I think that a lot of times we're willing to be corrected, but we're pretty grumpy about it. Now, there's a difference between public humiliation and privately going to a friend and going, you know, I love that quote, but you got it wrong, or I wish you had included this other aspect because that was incomplete. Do you know what I'm saying? So a lot of the interaction that we see was interaction that was in their private space, not in the public scene, right? Although there were those kinds of debates, and that's a different topic. But what I see in their letters, and I see in their manuscripts, and I hear in their stories, is how good it is for us to expect the best from one another and to genuinely help one another in the journey of getting better and better at what we do as we companion together. And you see that throughout the work of the Inklings, and I just think that that's remarkable. Not just that they were willing to take it, but that they became grateful to one another with a kind of joy and delight. This will help me to be better. This will help me to serve God better. This will help my scholarship to be more on track. And I think it's that attitude that I think is most important and that I hope is most contagious as we talk about this.
Did I see a question here? Ben? No? Come on up to Leanne. Can we get, can you get the microphone to Leanne, please? Josh, can you? Thank you. Can you speak to condescension? Can you speak to condescension?
Tell me your name again. Leanne. Thank you, Leanne, for the question. How do we deal with condescension? I think that actually C.S. Lewis and Max gave us the answer to that question last night. When we have a robust sense of who we are and how God loves us, the love that we know and the love that we experience from God can in fact overflow even in such a situation. I think that we can meet condescension with love to the extent that we are well established in the love of God for ourselves, and that each of us has to find the ways that communicates that to our souls. So our souls are secure and well fed, feasting on the Lord and his nature and his character. And I think that then when we're faced with that, it becomes so much easier just to be able to shrug or to laugh or to love in the face of that attitude.
Hello, I'm Matthew Elkin. How much does the perceived sense of privacy and anonymity of social media contribute to the current anger and divisiveness, and what do we do about that?
Matthew, I like that question very much. Thank you so much. I think that it is everything. I think that the perceived anonymity and impersonalization of social media is everything, and getting us to a place where we're able to be so hateful. Because as I said, I think there's a big difference between being hateful toward an ideas. There are ideas and assumptions that are contemptible, that are evil, and we must take our stand against them. I think what happens with social media is we forget that somehow behind that there's a person. There's a heart, probably a wounded heart. And I think it's very helpful in response to try to remember, how do I separate out responding robustly in truth to stand against untruth, right? In grace to stand against ungrace. How do we do that and also at the same time truth and also love? How do we perhaps only just pray for that person behind the scenes, right? Maybe that's the best we can offer, but there may be opportunities for us to affirm and encourage the individual, right? And bring them back into conversation. Because a lot of the things we see on social media particularly, they're not conversation, right? They're just flinging hate. And so we do well to stay out of the flinging, to remember the person, and to try what we can, where appropriate, to love that person behind those ideas and those expressions.
I will keep this succinct, but just to provide some context. I know there's all these social dynamics with social media and so forth that have contributed to the problem of people not being able to be civil to each other and so forth. But it seems also like there's genuinely a conflict of ideas that are completely incompatible, and that a worldview has arisen that is not interested in debate. It is interested in control, and much of it is against Christianity, it's against the West, and so forth. So my question is, I guess, what would you say are the limits of intellectual hospitality? And with this conference, to what extent, I mean, I don't mean to be, well, I better get to the point. My concern is we've got this big problem where the people that are really irate are not the people here. And I'm wondering, is our conference just kind of going off to the side and talking amongst ourselves when the real problem is there's a conflict of ideas where you can't just agree to disagree.
And what's your name?
Chris Ross.
Thank you, Chris. I hope that we didn't do all this just for ourselves. You know, I hope that we're doing this because being salt and light in the world really means something to us. I would suggest that perhaps even within these walls, there's a diversity of conviction that we can't even imagine. I think we assume much greater agreement simply because people are agreeable. And I think as we go through the conference, it'll be very interesting to see in how many ways we are radically different on some of life's most important issues, right? So I would say that for starters. But how do we bear witness in the light of someone who completely comes at it differently? The fact is, a lot of times we have to earn the right to be heard. And I think in a lot of times we don't do that. We just go in with guns blazing. And so I think about even dealing with my own daughter, with whom, and this will shock you, we have some differences of opinion. And here's what I've discovered in dealing with my teenager, is that when she honestly, sincerely, in her bones believes that I have her best interest in mind, she is so much more willing to listen to my point of view than when she thinks I'm just trying to pull one over on her or assert my own authority over her. So to the extent that I'm able to earn the right to a hearing with someone who looks at things from a very different perspective, I'm going to be a lot more effective. So rather than a noisy gong or clanging cymbal, if I can enter into relationship, if someone can express a view different from my own, and I can say to them, after I've listened well and honored that person, if after that I can say, you know what's really interesting? I look at that from a completely different point of view. And then you just let that hang. And they'll either say, well, that's you, at which point there's no fertile soil there, right? It's the parable of the sower and the seed. If there's no fertile soil there, then I can just joyfully go on. If they say, really, you do? What's that look like? Then I have the possibility of transforming, even only by inches, the conversation that we can have, and this person's view, right, of where I stand. So I think a lot of that is that gift of discernment in any given situation, that big long list, right, expanding on Arthur Brooks' 3 main responses, as we become more conversant in a variety of ways of responding in a situation like that, as we get better and better at it, I think the words that we have to share will be received more warmly and more effectively, and we'll be a lot less tired.
Hello, my name's Elizabeth. My question is, what do you recommend when one feels morally alone in an environment and is tempted to self-pity? And how do you discern whether it is best to stay in that environment or leave?
Elizabeth, I have no rule for that. I have no guideline. I can only tell you what helps me. So I'm an introvert, and when I feel very alone in the ideas that I have and the things that I value, I find books to be my best companions. And I'll sometimes carry them with me because I don't have to be reading them to know that here is a kindred spirit. And that bolsters me. Because sometimes I'm not, especially when I'm feeling vulnerable, I'm not brave enough to call a person. But for those of you who are brave, you extroverts, sometimes just to have one other person say, you're not crazy, and you're not alone. You're not the only one. It's a big deal. So find ways to care for yourself in the midst of those situations. Should you stay or should you go? I believe that at every moment we have to be open to the leading of the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit will be faithful, right? And as I said, so much of it has to do with the state of our hearts, detachment moving on can be a profoundly good thing. But I think that we have to ask God's permission and guidance before we do that, and we have to make sure that we're doing it for the reasons that are in fact holy and good. Thank you for your question. Thank you so much.